Hello and welcome back to my Mega Man analysis. Last time, I talked about Mega Man 1 in a general sense. Now, I'm gonna go through Cutman's level in excruciating detail, showing how it's built and also talking about the enemies. Levels in the Mega Man series are separated in many sub-areas that usually present different challenges. Each of these sub-levels usually presents the player with one challenge, which tends to consist of one or two types of enemies and/or obstacles, slowly escalating the difficulty until the final confrontation with the Robot Master. One weird quirk all the NES Mega Man games have is how vertical scrolling is handled. Horizontal scrolling happens smoothly, as it would in any usual platformer. But vertical scrolling happens one screen at a time. This is most likely due to memory limitations in the original NES, but it's also a situation where the developers worked well around the hardware limitations. The vertical scrolling gives the player enough time to react to any traps or enemies that would damage Mega Man otherwise. This is used effectively in the Quick Man stage in Mega Man 2, where part of the stage consists of long vertical areas with lasers that kill in one hit, and this brief period of scrolling is basically the time the player has to plot a way through each screen. In Mega Man 1, this is briefly used in the Gutsman stage, with some quick maneuvering leading to an extra life. Finally, let's talk about Cutman's level. Cutman's level is a very vertical level. It is basically a tower that must be climbed over in order to reach Cutman himself. The first 2/3 of the level are spent climbing, while the final one is spent dropping about half of the maximum height, followed by the boss. The level begins with Mega Man in an enclosed area, with a ladder nearby. The player must immediately learn to press up on the ladder to progress. Still on the first screen, there's a block in the way, which naturally requires learning how to jump. Mega Man also begins at the border of a block, with half of his body floating on the air, showing the player that jumps don't need to be too precise for him to stand on surfaces. As soon as the player jumps over the block, we get our first enemy, a floating helicopter-faced robot named Bombay Heli according to the Legacy Collections database. Those enemies are extremely weak, taking only one bullet to be destroyed. They do 3 units of damage, meaning it takes 10 hits for one of them to destroy Mega Man. As far as first enemies go, these are much more aggressive than, for example, Mario's Goombas, but also far less damaging. They work well to clearly show the player that enemies in this game are usually very aggressive, but also that Mega Man can take a lot of hits. The following screen has 2 small platforms that can be jumped over, but the path below is also possible and safe. The player is also attacked by about 4 more robots while crossing. It works as a training session for jumping and also possibly for shooting in the air. A first-time player will also most likely get hit by one of the enemies while jumping, letting the player know that doing so will make Mega Man stagger in a situation where missing the jump won't kill him. One enemy will attack Mega Man from below, making the lower route an easier way of dealing with all the enemies. This ends the first fairly small of this level's sub-areas. It is more of a small introduction, making the player familiar with the controls and with one type of enemy. The next part begins the ascension through Cutman's tower. The next enemy to be seen is a turret-like enemy with the incredibly creative name of Blaster. This turret fires 4 bullets in an angle from its position, each one slightly under 1 second apart from each other, followed by about 2 seconds of inactivity during which it cannot be destroyed. The first turret cannot hit a moving player, as Mega Man will be very far from the area its bullets can hit by the time it fires. The level is giving the player a way to learn how the challenges ahead will work, without any actual risk, before increasing the difficulty. Immediately ahead, there is another turret overlooking a ladder. There are 2 possible paths through this one, directly climbing a ladder or jumping through the platform. The ladder is clearly the best option, as Mega Man will be on the bullet's route for a much shorter time. The next 3 screens all have varying configurations of platforms and ladders, where the challenge is still dodging those turrets. The first screen has 3 turrets aiming left, while leaving the area the player starts at danger-free. The pit the player has to jump over is relatively simple, made even easier by the fact that, in case of fail, Mega Man simply falls to the top of the previous screen, so there isn't much risk. As the turrets alternate their fiery moments, the screen doesn't get too cluttered by bullets. The pathway also puts the 2 upper turrets at the mercy of Mega Man's fire, as both are easily reachable from the top of the left ladder. You won't be hit while standing there either, so jumping to shoot the turrets is perfectly safe. The second screen raises the difficulty a bit. There is now one turret aiming directly at the player's position as soon as the screen changes. The other two turrets fire at the left side of the screen, but there is absolutely no reason to even go to that side, unless you want to destroy every single enemy. And finally, the last screen in this section of the level is also clearly the hardest. This time around, there is a right-facing turret that will hit Mega Man if he doesn't move after entering the screen. The jump is also more complicated, with a higher risk of being hit by the first turret's fire. Differently from the previous screen, all three turrets are a risk this time, and, unlike 2 screens ago, there is no way of sniping them before crossing the areas they shoot at. As Mega Man's default weapon only shoots straight forward, the first turret is impossible to destroy without falling, and that responds it, and the other two must be hit from up close while being wide open to their bullets. This ends this section of the level. It clearly goes from simply introducing an enemy, this turret, to slowly presenting the player with different situations of increasing difficulty. The next part is an horizontal scrolling session, breaking off from the slower, tense climbing the player just went through, probably meant as a transition. Mega Man is immediately attacked by this machine that launches cut blades at him. These are more of a scare enemy than anything else, as simply moving forward will completely avoid them. In fact, they do a comparatively high 4 units of damage, and are indestructible unless using Bone Man's weapon, so the best strategy is really just running from them. Almost immediately after passing through the cut blades, the player is attacked by those jumping robots called Kamadoma. Those small blue enemies are capable of doing quite fast horizontal jumps in Mega Man's direction, but deal only 2 units of damage and have only 1 unit of health. What is happening here is that the cut blades are used to press the player onwards, increasing the odds the Kamadomas will get a hit in. After a small jump that mirrors the one before the first climb, Mega Man reaches the second and last climbing segment of the stage. Also mirroring the beginning, the player is introduced here to the enemy that will be the main challenge for the following section. An iRobot called Adhering Suzy, which I'm just gonna call iBot for short. Those robots move in a repetitive pattern, where each one is always locked either to a horizontal or to a vertical line. When they reach a wall, they rest for about 2 seconds and go back. Just like with the turrets all the way back, the first time the player sees one of those, it doesn't present any real risk. These enemies are considerably more dangerous than the turrets, as they take 5 hits to destroy instead of only 1, and deal 4 units of damage instead of 2. It's a little easier to see safe areas though, as they don't shoot. Still, they present a higher risk simply because of the increased damage and resistance. The only way the player can progress beyond this first enemy is by destroying it or just shoving it and taking damage, but that second kind of player probably died long ago. This assures the player knows they can be destroyed, which is useful because the following areas are considerably harder if the player simply tries to avoid every enemy. The positioning of this sacrificial iBot also might be because, with the exception of the borderline hazard cut blades, every enemy encountered up to this point was destroyed by only 1 bullet, while these take the aforementioned 5 to take down. This way, the player will definitely know some enemies take multiple hits to destroy, and probably also assimilate that the specific sound effect that plays when hitting an enemy means it was damaged. Immediately when Mega Man walks into the place this enemy was, another one spawns on the wall that becomes visible, but this time moving horizontally. It's also the first one that could pose a risk, but as it moves in a very big area, this risk is pretty small. The next screen features, predictably, more of those enemies, 3 moving horizontally and only 1 vertically. The challenge here is different from the one in the turrets area. While the turrets shoot relatively fast and force the player to rely more on fast reaction times, this area forces the player to pause and carefully plan out the path to take. This enemy marked blue blocks the passage with the ladder in a way that is really hard to go through without getting damaged, and even worse to try to jump and shoot it 5 times without being hit by the red enemy. Meanwhile, the purple and yellow enemies make most of the standing area on the upper half dangerous, and force the player to be careful with the timing. If the player has Gutsman's weapon, this block in the middle can be picked up and thrown at the enemies, clearing the path. This also justifies the need for the ladder, as the platform would be too tall to reach without it. Guts' arm also happens to be Cutman's weakness. Using this weapon to make the level easier, therefore, can make it low on energy for the boss battle, so the player has to think carefully before using it. Of course, what actually happens is that the weapon is barely used, but that is a problem endemic to any Mega Man game, as I mentioned last time. If the player dies from this point onwards, this screen is the respawn point. More specifically, the player spawns on the middle block with the red enemy immediately flying at Mega Man's face. It's generally not a good idea to hit your players as soon as they respawn. Needless to say, this isn't very frequent in any other game. The next screen is not exactly harder, but it forces the player to deal with the enemies in close quarters. The blue enemy has to be destroyed, but the red one only gives the player a passage one tile wide to jump through. Not only that, but those enemies sometimes rest for about 1 second instead of 2, making predictions harder. The yellow and purple enemies force the player to climb the stairs quick, and their spacing means that, if they're in sync, about half of the ladder will be dangerous. It's more of a slow timing challenge than anything else. The next and final screen of this section is rather odd. As you can see, the screen seems immediately much more dangerous, with 2 enemies moving extremely close to Mega Man. This can make the player panic a little, but the red enemy immediately to Mega Man's right can be easily dispatched. What's odd though, is that the green enemy on the top right and the blue enemy are completely useless. They're completely out of any player's way and pose no risk whatsoever. There's no real reward for killing them either. They're just creating a huge negative space and making the player focus only on the left. There is the completely useless score counter, so there is the risk of being hit versus the reward of getting some extra points. The score counter in this game is useless, however, and completely absent from later games. Still, the block in the middle is another one that can be thrown by the Guts arm, potentially hitting all 3 enemies, but also potentially increasing the area the blue enemy can get to. This ends the second and final climbing segment. It follows the same general principle of presenting the player with variations on a same challenge, although this time the increase in difficulty isn't as apparent. The general difficulty is much higher than before though, if only for the fact that the enemies themselves are much stronger. Next, again mirroring early parts of the level, Mega Man is greeted immediately by another cut blade launcher. This works to keep the player on the move, but is also a small break from the tension of climbing. The only real challenge here is jumping quickly enough to avoid the blades. Next, we have the return of the Bambai Helis from the beginning of the level. There is still no real danger, but note that one of them comes from below, when the only real way of going down is by the end of the screen, which forces the player to actually dodge its attacks. There is also a completely free health recovery item here, to give players a breather after the arduous climb. It is literally all downhill from here. At this point the stage is almost over, with only 4 screens left until the boss. The next 2 screens follow a similar if condensed pattern of repeating enemy types. The enemy this time is known as Mambo, a clamshell-like robot that floats to certain predefined positions and fires bullets in 8 directions from each position. This enemy's ability to cover most of the screen with its bullets matches well with Mega Man's ability to cover a lot of vertical ground really quick by falling due to the high gravity. It's an intimidating enemy, much harder to avoid than any other enemy up to this point, but that is somewhat eased by the fact that it only does 2 units of damage. It also moves in a loop, so Mega Man has no option but to dodge it. This Mambo in particular stops in 3 positions, the first of which does not hit Mega Man as he drops down the ladder. This gives the player about 2 seconds to react and move, as the second time the enemy fires will hit Mega Man otherwise. No area is really very safe, forcing players to be quick on their feet. If the player is more careful and holds on the ladder, Mega Man is just out of the way of the bullets, making it possible to safely observe the enemy. Those 2 small platforms in the middle area are relatively useless for Mega Man, but I assume they were put there to facilitate visualizing the places where the enemy fires, as well as where Mega Man should stand by not leaving a lot of open space. The leftmost one delays Mega Man a little though, potentially enough to make him vulnerable to one of the horizontal bullets. Finally, some players might see an easy opening on the right and jump down. This goes horribly wrong because of the two spikes positioned exactly to destroy this shortcut. It is a little underhanded and quite evil, especially because at this point the player doesn't even know there are spikes on this level. It forces Mega Man to follow the right path, instead of just jumping down though. Considering the level is almost over, I assume the designers felt okay with not pulling too many punches here. This screen has a second mumble, and as expected, this one already homes in on Mega Man's landing position with the first shots. The mid-platform this time is a little more to the left, making Mega Man vulnerable slightly longer. The spikes below work for intimidation, but aren't really that dangerous unless the player is hit in the middle platform from the left, in which case Mega Man staggers back with the hit and falls to his explosive death on the spikes. As mentioned in part 1, getting killed by spikes even during the Mercy invincibility after getting damaged is a behavior exclusive to Mega Man 1. In this situation, the spikes were clearly positioned to explore this effect, which makes me assume that it was a deliberate design choice reversed in later games. Next, we have a 2-screen long horizontal area that is the last one before the boss gate. Mega Man is immediately greeted by a bouncing and horribly strong enemy called Big Eye. This thing is a mini-boss of sorts that randomly switches between short and high jumps. Mega Man can run under it during the high ones, but not during the short ones. To make matters worse, it's huge, takes insane 20 hits to destroy, which is usually too much to kill it before it reaches you, and does 10 units of damage on contact. Most stages in Mega Man 1 have one of those right before the boss gate. This is not something usually seen in later games, and that is probably for the best. The Big Eye basically guarantees that the player will get to the boss with a good chunk of health gone, and is a very frustrating way of ending a stage, not to mention a huge difficulty spike. Later games do have similar enemies, but they're usually dotted around the stage instead of right before the boss. In this particular case though, Mega Man lands in a pile of blocks that give him the high ground, allowing a precise jump over the Big Eye. The blocks can also be thrown using Guts Arm, which just so happens to be its weakness. Again, using the weapon here means risking not being able to use it later, especially if it's already weakened from prior use. On a side note, I like the way the first Wily level uses this enemy. Just before entering Wily's fortress, Mega Man is attacked by 3 Big Eyes in rapid succession. Considering so far those were only encountered right before the boss fight, this clearly shows that the stakes are higher and the final confrontation approaches. Back to the level, every Mega Man game has an empty corridor, usually 1 screen long, before every boss fight. These serve as a way to build up the tension before the final battle, as well as a comfortable respawn point for when the boss inevitably kills you, which spares the player from having to cross half of the level over and over again. The first Mega Man, however, has enemies and traps on those corridors. Some of them aren't even horizontal, such as Electmans. This not only makes things harder, but also removes the guarantee that your immediate rematches with the boss will start with Mega Man at full health. They still work as a build-up for the boss, but aren't exactly as effective. Not to mention they are quite frustrating sometimes. After this long and arduous journey, Mega Man finally reaches the first, for us at least, robot master of his fight against Dr. Wily, Cutman. In universe, Mega Man 1's bosses were originally built to assist humans with various tasks, Cutman in particular being a wood-cutting robot. Mega Man himself was built to assist their creator, Dr. Light. This can be seen by how similar Mega Man and Cutman look. Interestingly enough, as the series progresses, the bosses depart more and more from the original Mega Man-like design. I like to think of this as Wily branching out more and more with his own designs and skills. The battle room itself has, as mentioned before, 2 platforms that are actually rocks that can be thrown by Gutsman's weapon, which will each take out exactly half of Cutman's health. They are, however, useful for easier dodging, meaning if the player misses, there will only be a small platform remaining to use as high ground. Cutman fights by throwing his head blade at Mega Man like a boomerang. while also running around himself. The player has, therefore, to dodge both while shooting Cutman. What makes this fight relatively easy is the fact that, differently from most bosses in the game, Cutman staggers back a little when hit. Furthermore, if his cut blade is on his head when he's hit, he usually has a delay of about 1 second before firing again, meaning you can almost stunlock him. To make things even easier, playing on Cutman's weakness to rock, he is the only robot master that takes 3 units of damage from Mega Man. And we're done. The player can now grab Cutman's power and progress to the next level. Thanks for watching my ramblings on Mega Man. You might have noticed that my video output has been rather slow recently, and there's a good reason for that. I'm actually developing a game for release hopefully on Steam in the coming months, and as things progress, studying the game design of other games takes less priority. For the next few months, I'll aim to release a new video every 2 weeks instead of every week, but I'll also soon start posting updates on this other project on this channel for those who are interested. Again, thank you very much for your continued interest on my ramblings about video games. Next time, we'll continue the analysis of Super Mario World, followed by more analysis on other games later. See you soon!